So sorry I got interrupted. But now we're going through your book on the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And this will be part 3, actually part 2. We're going over the questions at the end of your book. And so we were on describing, I think it's chapter 5 here, the leech. So who is going to be the leech? Well, we find out that Roger Chillingworth, just his name Chillingworth, gives us chills in our spine as he turns out to be that character of the leech, right? In this chapter. So who is Roger Chillingworth? Well, he just happens to be her husband, which she thinks is at the bottom of the sea, and that has died 2 years earlier. And now he's coming back to see that she has a baby. And so he has wanting to have revenge. Revenge maybe on her, maybe on the baby, but most likely on whoever the baby's father is, right? And Roger Chillingworth is this older man, kind of humped back, and appearing to be kind of his nature of being ugly. Now, he was actually shipwrecked and had spent this time with the Indians. And coming back from that, he had learned a lot about different herbs and medicines, mainly from the Indian tribes, right? And so now he's coming back disguised as a doctor. And saying he needs to see his patient. His patient is his wife, which they don't know is his wife. And she is in jail. So Roger Chillingworth comes in, and Hester is very hesitant to take any medicine from him. You wonder why, thinking, well, he might be wanting to poison me. And then she's thinking, well, it might be just fine if I'm poisoned anyway. But then she thinks of her child, and she's worried about the baby, So she says to him, and he's basically saying, "Oh, I don't want to harm you," thinking he wants to harm someone else, of course, to find out who the father of the baby is. So what does he want to know from her? You guessed it. He wants to know who the father is, who this man has come in, and that she's had an affair with his wife, right? Even though they did not have a good relationship at all, of course. But knowing this, of course, this makes Hester very hesitant and very nervous, you can imagine. So wanting that, Chillingworth basically describing their marriage. It says describe what their marriage is like. Well, she basically said right there that she has never loved him, and looking at his physical deformities, you may see maybe that's why she didn't really love him. I don't know. But not only his physical deformities, but maybe his nature, and he was a lot older. Basically, she had been brought in as his wife because her family was in need, and they thought that he could support her, right? So that's what we see. Another thing, when he smiled at her, she looked and she thought, he's smiling just like she would think Satan would be smiling at her. So she looked at him right away as evil. But one thing, he had her take an oath. What was the oath about? He said, you need to take this oath with me that you will not reveal to anyone who I am. And so she did take that oath and say that she would not tell anyone that he was her husband. So he wasn't planning to go back with her in any way, was he? So, and he'd be disguised. So, that whole chapter really is kind of showing what he was like, labeling him as the leech. So the next chapter, as we go, it's going on here, and it's talking about Hester and her going on to talk about her needlework. Well, we know that she's really good at needlework and sewing because she has made this beautiful A on her own that's shocking with gold trim and lace and everything. So we know that she has a gift. Well, now we're going to find out a little bit more about her gift. So basically, Hester, first of all, she decides, even after she does her penance of 3 months in jail, wearing this letter A wherever she goes, and she says she has given up her individuality. Now she's just become a symbol. She thought, I'm just a walking symbol of a letter A scarlet letter. I am the scarlet letter, is what she's saying. So she walks out from her prison door, and now she says, I no longer borrow from the future. Nothing's going to be able to help me. Why doesn't she just leave the town, right? You'd think that she would just take the babe and leave, but she decides to stay there. And she decides to stay there because of a few different reasons. We know maybe she's still in love with the father of the baby, maybe, but basically she decides to take that daily shame, thinking, yes, this shame might be good for me, feeling like, oh, I have sinned a great sin, and maybe through all of this, my life will be perfected, or looking at that in a different way. The torture would purge her soul, she said, and work out a purity which she felt that she had lost. She felt like she had lost her purity, and now maybe this would make going through all this would be like a martyr to what had happened, right? So, for what occasions then? Now she has to support herself. Well, she has a gift, we know, of sewing and making beautiful, beautiful clothing. And so now, who is she going to be able to do this? How is she going to be able to sell it? Well, she finds that a lot of men in those days, they wore these ceremonial ruffles and gloves. So first of all, she could make a lot of these beautiful ruffles pretty easily, and and gloves for these men, and they would come and want them, because who wants to, sew ruffles for men? Not too many. And most of them were magistrates, so she would be able to give them, and they would not feel anything about getting them from her. And so on to funerals, a lot of funerals, and of course they wanted to make beautiful clothes to put on those that they would bury, at their funerals. And so she started, making clothes for funerals. Also from babies, she started making a lot of baby clothes and such, because for her baby was adorned in this beautiful, beautiful lace work and everything. Even growing up, the young girl becomes shocking because of all the beautiful clothing she puts on the baby. So she does a lot of clothing for babies, and men's scarves, and also onto some dresses and some women things. A lot of women looked down on her, but they were willing to take her great needlework. But she was never ever allowed to do anything of a wedding dress, because of her impurity, as they saw it. She could not make wedding clothes or veils. Kind of hypocritical, huh? And how is she regarded in the community? Well, she kind of was like this symbol ghost walking through. We know that. But, people would look on her like she had poison, a subtle poison as they looked. And children would mock her as they walked by, looking, knowing. And the new people that came in, they would stare until they found out her story, and they too would treat her as an outcast. So she had no close friends at that time, and people just looked at her like, poor soul. But she also had a kind heart. So she also made clothing too for people that were in poverty that would come in. So someone that would come in and hadn't the money for clothes, she would actually sew clothes for them and help the poor. So you can see Hester's heart. And how did the poor act to her? Well, some of them were grateful, but others, as soon as they found out who she was, they too would ostracize her and put her down too. So she really didn't have anyone at first that would call that she was a blessing in any way, or even say, oh, thank you so much, right? But as time went, things would change. So it's basically too, on question 4, it talks about penance, because she thought that are basically the author thought that probably this needlework was kind of a form of penance for her. Well, what's penance? When you think of penance, what do you think of? You think of doing something penance for your sins. Soothing this passion in her life that was rejected as sin, that she would have to do something, paying for her own sin, right? And that being a mode of penance. The question is, what is penance? It's paying for your own sin. And so not only the Scarlet Letter, but also all of her work she did would pay for her in some way, purge out her sins, but also pay for her penance. So, well, what does the Bible teach about penance, I hope? Well, what does the Bible say? Well, the Bible does say that we'll reap what we sow, right? And sometimes, especially if you're not a born-again Christian, if you don't know the Lord, then you may have to, you may think you have to purge out your sins. But why did Jesus die on the cross? Jesus died on the cross, was buried and rose again to take our penance. Because we could never pay for our sin. The wages of sin is death, and death would be eternal death away from our beautiful, beautiful God the Father. So Jesus came, and he was that Lamb of God that took away our sins and took our penance. Got to remember that. This story kind of goes over that. Hawthorne's not really big on grace, is he? As he goes through in the culture of the Puritan having to pay for their penance. And that's what, they thought she would have to do. So let's go on to the next. One other question. It says, number 5, what effect did the Scarlet Letter seem to have on Hester as other people looked at it? Well, as other people looked at it, she actually would withdraw, and, in her heart would think that possibly it's doing a refining work. She never really looked at them as hurting her, or looked at them as hating them. Like basically saying, well, Father, forgive him, I deserve it, I deserve this, but never looked at them. She thought she deserved her penance. And what did the letter seem to reveal about the various people who looked on it? We see, as we're going through the book, and we see how they react, what do you think about them? Well, it showed their hearts, didn't it? Their hypocritical hearts. Because they would think that they were out without sin. It's like, who's ever without sin, throw the first stone. So Jesus said to the woman that was caught in adultery in the Bible, right? So they were throwing stones, but they had sinful hearts, of course. And so here we see the people that would throw these stones would be very cold and hypocritical and not caring and empathetic people, would they be? As for looking to be able to stone her to death with their eyes, So that's chapter 5. Let's go on to chapter 6. Chapter 6 talks about now looking at her baby, her little girl. She named her Pearl. She's a very important character in this book too. And she was always arrayed in beautiful clothing, of course, because her mother could sew beautiful things. And so she was considered like an infant princess to her, and a child with many, of many children, really, because she had a personality too. Like one day like this and one day like that. And she was, they called her like an elf or a sprite and all these names for her as she wandered in the wilderness there and played amongst the wildflowers and amongst the brooks and talked to herself with imaginary characters, all these things. That was Pearl. She was named Pearl because her mother thought she would be the greatest treasure, the pearl of great price from the Bible, that she would be her mother's only treasure. Isn't that sweet? But that's what she was. Hawthorne's attitude toward discipline. Did Pearl get a lot of discipline? Well, No. You could imagine her mother was always thinking, oh, she's my treasure. It's really hard to discipline her, right? And so she got a little bit out there sometime. She was basically Hawthorne himself, you can see, did not approve of strict discipline. Even in his own family, he didn't, because of his Puritan backgrounds of strict discipline. He went opposite way. So, basically saying here, Proverbs 3:11, says, that we what is it? Spare the rod and spoil the child. We don't see that Pearl gets very many spankings, right? And sometimes she speaks right up what she wants to speak, and knowing she's very bold in the midst of a Puritan society. We see her opposite of all of the other children around. In fact, it says, how did she get along with other children? Not well at all, because she saw as her mother walked through that they were all giving her mother, dirty looks, and were looking down, and she found that out right at first, that she and her mother were both outcast, and that she was considered the scarlet letter of her mother, that she was considered not only the baby, as a baby and a young girl, that she was considered even as evil as her mother would be evil. And of course, she would get mad, and she would start flinging rocks at them. If they called her mother names and mocked, she'd start throwing rocks at them. She was not afraid, was she? She was a pretty bold little child. And it says, what did Pearl do when she played? All through the book, you're going to see she had imaginary characters, both young and old. She talked to the trees and the flowers because they were her friends. She danced like a fairy in the midst of the meadow. And she looked in, she thought about things that children don't always think, but with a great imagination. What did she notice about her mother? What do you think she noticed about her mother most? Well, she grew up as a baby, right? Her mother holding her the whole time. What would she see? She came looking at that scarlet letter, and thinking that scarlet letter represented her mother gave her great joy. She had great joy in that scarlet letter A, and did not look at it like the rest of the world looked at it first. So that's what she noticed first, was that letter. And she'd say, oh, there's my mom. There's my mom. You can imagine maybe from a distance, as she got older and she looked, and she'd remember that scarlet letter as part of her mother's life. Going on to chapter 7, we have the governor's hall. The governor's hall being this, it describes the governor, who he was, that he was the political leader at that time. The governor's hall was very fancy. And basically Hester was going to see him. Well, what was she going to see him about? It says, well, what was she? 2 reasons for visiting. Number 1, she made some fancy gloves for him, because he, again, needed, of course, these gloves that were in style for those that were politically in the magistrates and such. They all had to wear gloves. So she had made a pair of gloves for him and was bringing for his occasion for state, because he needed them as he was going to speak, and he needed those gloves. But also, she came because there was a possibility that she had heard, and she was worried about, that they wanted to take away Pearl. They wanted to take her daughter away from him, because they believed that she was evil and she should not be able to even raise her daughter. Coming in there like child protection, thinking they're going to take her away. And so she wanted to go to the governor and plead her case before they just came and took her away. So as it says, describe the way Pearl walked with her mother in there. As when you come in, you can imagine, number 3 says, describe the Bellingham's mansion there. He lived in a mansion. It was so beautiful. It was a large wooden home, but it was set almost like Aladdin's place. And it had the gardens outside, beautiful gardens, and the stucco walls would glimmer with these glass that looked like diamonds. And so this child coming in, looking and saying, oh, this is like fairy tale land, as she's going in here. And so as she walked with her mother, she didn't just walk with her mother. First of all, she wanted to be carried all the time. And so her mother carried her, but then she wanted to let down, and then she'd walk in front of her mother, and she'd be tripping and tumbling and playing and, constantly in motion. She was a very energetic child. She's a beautiful child with these dark eyes, and she's running through, and her mother dressed her in this velvet tunic with these bright red scarlets on her tunic that kind of matched that scarlet letter. So we see her coming in, not just a quiet little girl, but a rambunctious little girl. So, chapter 8, the elf child and the minister. Of course, who's the elf child? We know the elf child was considered. They considered her that way. Well, so here she is. This chapter takes place too in the mansion there at the Bellingham's mansion at the governor's, and so it says. So how or Hawthorne's true Puritan attitude toward conflict and luxury. So of course he describes the luxury of the mansion, and he's saying, yes, but Puritans were supposed to not be, live in these comfortable lifestyles. They were supposed to be plain. But here he says now we have the Puritan governors now looking like King James or something. So he's thinking about now the attitude has changed in the Puritans from the simpleness of the Puritan cultures, when you think of the Pilgrims very simply dressed, to now a huge mansion and comfortable things. Number 2 says, what impression did the men have of Pearl's religious training? Remember, she was there. So here we come into the mansion. She sees, basically sees the governor, and he sees and says, what is this little elf doing here, And then the mother comes in, and who and behold are there but Reverend Dimmesdale and Roger Chillingworth, her husband, and we'll find out more about Dimmesdale. So as they come in, and also the older governor, or the older pastor, is there too. As they come in, they look and think, oh, is this child really getting religious training? Has she been brought up in the catechisms? Yes or no? And so the question that is asked to her, is basically the question is, who made you? And she put her finger on her mouth, knowing who made her, that God had made her. But instead, she just thought, is this a joke or what? And she said, I'm not made at all, she said. In fact, my mother just plucked me off the rose bush in front of the prison door. Not the right thing to say, right? So what did the men conceive for Pearl's future? They wanted to take her away from her mother and put her under another care, maybe even a collective care. When you think of that, maybe an orphanage or under somebody else's care, and bring her in, into these catechism of such. They wanted to do this, to put her, to take her and put her under somebody else's taking care of her, not with her mother, is what. But basically, what did Hester think? She cried out a bunch of times, and said that Pearl is my treasure. She's my happiness, Plus, she also said, and she also is my torture nonetheless, because she is my Scarlet Letter, but she's my treasure, both. And going on, she said, she is my retribution for my sin. I need her, or else I will die if you take her away. And God gave her to me. So then the elder of the pastor asked the young pastor, Dimmesdale, in her defense, what do you think? What do you think we should do, Reverend Dimmesdale? And what was the result? That Hester would be able to keep the child, to remind her of her Scarlet Letter. So Dimmesdale basically stands up and says, this child came from the hand of God to work on this lady's heart, to be a blessing and to be a retribution. And even her garb matches the Scarlet Letter. So this child was really to keep her mother's soul alive, so that her mother might not fall into more blacker sins or darker sins. So they look and think, oh, that's good, yeah, okay. Reverend Dimmesdale says she could keep him, so she was allowed to keep Pearl. So on it says, according to the Bible, who is responsible for rearing children? Yeah, the parents, right? Not to put them in some collective orphanage or somebody else. The parents are responsible. The easy question there. So going on to that was chapter 8, going on to chapter 9 here. I'm going to chapter 9, and I kind of skipped around here a little bit. Chapter 9, and again, talks about the leech. So it says, how did Roger Chillingworth and Mr. Dimmesdale become good friends? So now we have Roger. We have him at the mansion coming down, but now they're good friends. Well, we find out that Roger Chillingworth came so that he could actually have spiritual guidance from this young pastor, and that he thought, oh, he's a ordained apostle. Really? Do you think he really wanted to do that? Well, but also everyone thought that, Mr. Dimmesdale, Pastor Dimmesdale, had a medical condition that he kept, like all of a sudden his heart would hurt or something. And so they thought, oh, that this is great. This doctor has come. It's a miracle. So he could be with this young pastor and help him with his medical conditions, right? And so they became friends. Well, how did Roger Chillingworth learn about herbs and roots? Because he was feeding them herbs and roots. Did he go to school for being a doctor? No. He actually learned about them in Indian captivity. And so when he was taken captive from that boat, he learned a lot about these herbs, and he was actually taking these herbs and making new pharmacology. So pharmacopoeia, he calls it there. That's what Hawthorne calls it. And it says, what were the symptoms of Mr. Dimmesdale failing health? Well, his health were failing. His voice had decayed. He started just having all these problems. But the big thing is he had these pain in flesh that would come. So he'd always hold his hands over his heart, which becomes a symbol, right? Holding your hands over a heart. So that was, and the people, what was Dimmesdale's attitude towards his health? He said, well, I don't need any medicine, right? He'd always put his hand over his heart. So basically, he was saying, well, I want to die. Why would he want to die? Finally, he agreed to confer with the physician and said, I would rather that my sins and labors be a burden in my grave rather than put my life in your hand and you healing me. But the people wanted him to have this doctor, so the doctor stayed. How did the people feel about Roger Chillingworth again? That they loved him. They thought this doctor dropped from the sky as a miracle from God, it says, and that he could be associated from all the great cities that he must have traveled in Europe, and now he came to their little town. So, and what practices was he associated with? With pharmacology or pharmakia. The practice that he was associated was basically he learned from incantations of the Indians and conjuring. So he was really into the black art, too, which are very satanic. So how do these characterize his satanic nature? He was also into like witchcraft and sorcery and pharmakia. All that kind of go together, weren't they, for his patient here. So chapter 10 goes right into the leech and his patient. What was, let's see, go back to the question I had. What was it about Chillingworth that made Dimmesdale not uncomfortable? Because he said, well, where did you gather those herbs? What are those flabby leaves? And he says, well, I gathered them in the graveyard next to a newfound grave that I had. Would you want to take that? Make you a little bit uncomfortable. So it kind of made him manifest that something was wrong, but he still took whatever poisons that he gave him, thinking that would help cure him. What was Dimmesdale's view of confession of sin? Well, Dimmesdale, basically, you can see, thought that you'd have to do penance, that basically, that if you held it in and hid your sin, that you would be like a dead corpse. Maybe that's what happens to Dimmesdale, huh? A dead corpse. And basically, going on, that it was important to confess your sin, even publicly, but we'll find out more about how he did not. On to number 3 on chapter 10 says, what was Chillingworth's view of confession? Well, we have Chillingworth and we have Dimmesdale thinking that. Well, Chillingworth, of course, he thought there was a fear to take up shame that belongs to them, that they needed to, everyone needed to take their own shame, and they needed to be cleansed of their unclean hearts. And so basically taking, again, another works-oriented, saying, okay, you have a spiritual condition. You need to tell me your sin, right? Is what he's saying. So what is the Bible's view of confession? Well, we know. We can see in 1 John 1:9, basically says that we have an advocate for the Father, who is Jesus Christ, that Jesus has cleansed us of his sin, and he's constantly in the process of cleansing of our sin. Right? We have to go to Jesus for the cleansing of our sin. And basically going on to confess our sins one to another so that we can be healed. So the Bible took a different attitude than neither Dimmesdale or Chillingworth had. Basically theirs was an attitude of penance. And even Heather had that attitude. Or Hester. I was calling her Heather. So, and then what did they see? In the midst of all this happening in chapter 10, they saw Pearl, the little girl that Hester had come to town, and she was dancing on the grave outside the window. What is this little elf dancing on the window? This is definitely the mother's Scarlet Letter. And so she took the burrs off, burrs, those sticky things. She took them off, and then she took them and she threw them at Dimmesdale, like, here's your burrs, here's your sin, or whatever. And then going on, she took these little burrs and gave them to her mother to put burrs around her Scarlet Letter. But what a deal is that? Also, it says, what did Chillingworth say was the cause of Dimmesdale's physical problem at this time? So he said, oh, you have a strange disease, I do say. And this is due to some hidden sores that you may have, and maybe they're manifest by some spiritual problem that you have. So you should confess your spiritual problem to me and lay open your soul so that your spiritual wounds can be healed, and then your body will be healed. He wanted to know something, didn't he? Maybe he wanted to know if he was the father of Pearl, Dimmesdale. So here we're getting the crescendo when we're finding out more about Dimmesdale. So what did Chillingworth ask Dimmesdale to do? And I told you, to lay open your soul, your troubled soul, and confess. How did Dimmesdale respond to this? He got very agitated, of course, and he said, no, I'm not going I don't need to confess to any earthly physician that part of my life. Let God do as he pleases. And then he says, I commit myself to the physician of my soul, which is God, he says. And then he gets mad and he rushes out of the room. So what happens to Chillingworth? Yes, Chillingworth says, this is the man. This is the man who had an affair with my wife. And this is the man now that I need to take revenge on. We'll go on in the next video.